Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a really extensive deep dive into Noam Chomsky's 2000 work, Rogue States, The Rule of Force in World Affairs. And this book, it's not just a critique of foreign policy, it's a really meticulous exploration of power dynamics on the international stage.
Yeah.
It forces you to confront a huge systemic question.
Right, and that core question really is, how is the very definition of international order, of law, of what's considered acceptable conduct, how is that controlled by those with the most military and economic power?
Exactly.
I mean, we live in a world where these foundational norms are constantly being challenged, right?
Mhm.
Multilateral institutions are. Well, they're often just bypassed or ignored completely. So understanding the structural incentives behind that behavior, it isn't just an academic exercise. It's, absolutely essential for getting a handle on modern geopolitical crises.
That's it. Our mission today is pure systems analysis. We're not trying to assign simple blame to individuals. That's not the point.
No.
We are looking for the underlying structures, the economic incentives, and, the propagandistic narratives that consistently and predictably produce these foreign policy outcomes. Outcomes that almost always favor the powerful and often operate way outside the constraints of international law.
We're looking for the why.
The why of systemic behavior. And we're going to be looking at the documentary and historical record that Chomsky draws on to build his case.
Okay, so let's unpack this with some author context. We're starting with Noam Chomsky, who is, I think it's fair to say, a foremost and definitely one of the most prolific critics of U.S. foreign policy.
He really is. And his whole methodology is famous for synthesizing history, leaked government documents, and a very sophisticated kind of propaganda analysis into this coherent and often, deeply uncomfortable critique.
Yeah, his approach really requires cutting through all the established political noise and just looking at what states do, not what they say.
Precisely. And Rogue States was published right around the turn of the millennium in 2000. It was a direct, very timely response to the single biggest geopolitical shift of the late 20th century.
The end of the Cold War.
The end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was gone. And with it, the traditional decades-long pretext for maintaining this massive global military machine for these continuous intervention forces.
The Kremlin onslaught, the communist threat.
All of that, it just vanished overnight. And that creates this profound narrative vacuum.
A vacuum, right.
Yeah.
And in a global power system that's built on continuous military projection and economic control, you can't have a vacuum for long.
Nature abhors a vacuum, exactly. And Chomsky meticulously documents how new justifications were needed immediately to maintain that policy infrastructure to keep the funding levels up.
So the rhetoric had to shift.
Dramatically. The threat pretext pivoted to focus really heavily on international terrorism, narco-traffickers, and crucially, the concept that gave the book its title, Rogue States.
And this is all happening in a specific context, right? Post-World War II, the U.S. had taken on this role of world leadership, reaching heights of power and wealth that were just unprecedented in history.
Completely unprecedented. The source material even notes this almost, rueful recognition from the British Foreign Office after the war, basically saying that Britain would now just be a junior partner in world domination.
Just a junior partner.
The U.S. had the power, and the decades that followed were all about defining the terms of global engagement on its own terms.
Okay, so that recognition of this highly concentrated power structure is key. Because if you hold that much power, you either set the rules for everyone else or you just decide you're exempt from them.
And that gets us right to Chomsky's central thesis, which we're going to drill down on today. The idea is that this concept of a rogue state, a nation that disregards international norms and law, is mainly a propagandistic tool. It's selective.
So powerful states use it to justify punishing their adversaries.
Right. While at the same time, they insulate themselves from that same label even when they are acting as literal rogue states, completely unbound by international legal constraints.
That sets up this foundational argument perfectly. The dual definition of the rogue state. You have the one for public consumption, the propagandistic label.
Yes. That's the label you apply to your chosen adversaries. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Libya, Cuba, North Korea. The goal is to portray them not just as hostile, but as fundamentally irremediably evil.
They're the designated targets of outrage.
Exactly. And often it doesn't even matter what specific crimes they commit. The real crime is that they refuse to submit to the global order that's dictated by the hegemon. They are, by definition, the enemy.
Okay, but then there's the other definition, the literal one.
The literal, functional definition, a state that does not see itself as bound by international norms, the UN Charter, treaties, World Court decisions, you name it. And Chomsky argues that if you just look at the documented historical practice, logic and history confirm that the most powerful states tend to fall into this second category.
Unless they're constrained from within.
Unless they are heavily constrained internally by their own population or their own institutions.
So what's the mechanism that lets this dual reality exist?
Chomsky calls it the exemption principle. The most powerful state sees itself as fundamentally exempt from the international norms and treaties that might restrict its freedom to act. And what's crucial here is that this stance became much more overt, much more unapologetic after the Cold War ended.
Why then?
Well, because without a serious Soviet deterrent in the picture, the powerful felt that, and this is a quote, pretense can be largely dropped. They could just declare their intention to act unilaterally, openly.
When a state gets that powerful, where do the constraints even come from? We've heard this idea articulated in formal policy, and the book points to a classic statement of this principle from former Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
Oh, yes. This was in 1963, and he's speaking to the American Society of International Law of all places.
The irony.
Incredible. And he states, very bluntly, that the propriety of defending U.S. power, position, and prestige is not a legal issue.
It's not a legal issue.
Meaning, the decision to use force or coerce other nations is purely political and strategic. It's not bound by the niceties of law. Even more chilling, he'd said earlier that international law is only useful to gild our positions with an ethos, but that fundamentally the U.S. isn't bound by it when its vital interests are at stake.
That's the core doctrine of a literal rogue state. Law is just a tool for PR.
It's for rhetorical convenience, not a restriction on power. That's the whole idea.
That is just a staggering admission, especially when you realize it's being said explicitly and just, accepted by the political and intellectual class. It means the U.S. is operating in its own sovereign sphere outside the legal framework it helps design for everyone else.
Exactly. And to manage the public perception of that, Chomsky describes what he calls the Orwellian principle, selective outrage.
Okay, explain that.
Well, this principle is what allows the exemption principle to persist without constant public contradiction. The idea for powerful states is twofold. First, portray your targets as irredeemably evil. Second, portray your own actions as glorious, necessary, and just.
So how does the system actually manage to invert reality like that?
Through a really chilling mechanic that Chomsky calls the inversion. The more crimes you can charge to an enemy, especially if they're crimes we can do nothing about, the greater the public and political outrage must be.
Okay.
But conversely, the more we are responsible for an atrocity and the more we can do about them, which usually just means stop supporting the perpetrators, the less concern there is, the less media attention, the quieter the whole discussion becomes.
So if an ally or a regime the U.S. supports is committing horrific crimes, we just look the other way.
Or, to use Orwell's phrase from 1984, you demonstrate a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. Chomsky calls it Orwellian nationalism. The victims essentially become unpeople.
They don't exist in the discourse.
Precisely. And the historical examples that the source material pulls from are just stunning. They show how deep this filtering mechanism goes. Take the Cold War period. The brutal state terror in U.S. domains in Latin America, Guatemala, El Salvador, was statistically and functionally far more horrendous than the repression in Eastern Europe at the same time.
But who did we hear about?
Who was championed in the West as a brave dissident fighting totalitarianism. Only the Eastern European figures.
Right, that structural disparity is the whole point. The victims in Latin America, the tens of thousands who were murdered, disappeared, tortured, they were functionally invisible. They were the unpeople.
Absolutely. The book highlights the murder of 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador, which happened right after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. They were murdered by an elite battalion that was trained by the U.S. military, a battalion known for mass murders.
And in the West.
Almost nothing. Negligible attention compared to any comparable crime in the enemy bloc, because this one implicated our own policy, our own support structure.
And this selective outrage wasn't just for client states, right? It extended to crimes committed by actual NATO allies.
Yes, and the case of Turkey is just a shocking example. Turkey was a critical NATO ally, and throughout the 1990s, they were carrying out this horrific counterinsurgency campaign against their own Kurdish population.
I remember hearing about this, but the scale.
The scale was immense. Tens of thousands killed, millions displaced, thousands of towns and villages just destroyed, and the response from Washington, specifically under the Clinton administration.
I mean, yes, massive military support.
Massive military support. The U.S. provided 80% of Turkey's arms, and the flow of weapons actually increased as the atrocities mounted. In 1997 alone, the book notes, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey than the U.S. had provided during the entire Cold War period leading up to that campaign.
80%.
It is.
That's profound. So we were directly fueling this systematic violence against the Kurds. But at the exact same time, you had politicians and the media expressing these passionate, high-minded laments about atrocities happening in the Balkans.
It's the perfect illustration of selective vision. One set of crimes is amplified for geopolitical reasons, while the other, the one we are deeply complicit in, is essentially rendered silent.
It's the propaganda mechanism at work.
It ensures that the atrocities we support are virtually unreported, which insulates the policy from any democratic pressure. Meanwhile, those committed by official enemies are lamented with great passion. This rhetorical success is absolutely crucial because it allows for the structural subordination of international law and treaties.
Let's focus on that subordination. We mentioned Dean Acheson, but the explicit declared doctrine of unilateral power, the Clinton-Albright doctrine, that really needs to be underlined because it's a direct challenge to the UN Charter itself.
It is. The official declared stance of the U.S. government under Clinton was that it would act multilaterally when possible, but unilaterally when necessary to defend vital interests.
And they were pretty clear about what vital interest meant.
Very explicit. They listed them as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources.
Well, when you define vital interests that broadly, you've basically given yourself an open-ended justification for any action. It's a demonstration of contempt for the UN Charter.
The Charter is unambiguous. It's the foundation of modern international order. It bans the threat or use of force except when authorized by the UN Security Council or in self-defense under Article 51. But powerful states, especially the U.S., claim the unilateral right to define their own interests and act however they choose.
So they're essentially saying the Charter only applies to law-abiding states.
Which, by this very definition, are the weaker states that don't have the power to ignore it.
The 1998 Iraq crisis was a really public and fascinating case study of this open contempt for the UN framework, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. When the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, reached an agreement with Iraq on weapons inspections, the UN Security Council unanimously endorsed it. But crucially, the Council explicitly rejected U.S. and U.K. demands for an automatic trigger to use force.
So what did the resolution actually say?
It warned of severest consequences for noncompliance, but it stressed that the Council would remain actively seized of the matter. In other words, only the Council gets to decide on the use of force, which is exactly what the Charter says.
But Washington's response was basically immediate defiance. They told the UN its own resolution was irrelevant.
Instantly. The U.S. Ambassador, Bill Richardson, asserted in direct contravention of the unanimous resolution that the agreement did not preclude the unilateral use of force. Then the State Department spokesperson, James Rubin, went even further. He dismissed the actual wording of the resolution as not as relevant as the kind of private discussions that we've had.
Private discussions are more relevant than a unanimous UN Security Council resolution.
Apparently so. And President Clinton himself insisted the resolution provides authority to act if the U.S. wasn't satisfied. The message couldn't have been clearer. The actual legal constraints of the UN Charter are less important than the private political will of Washington. The U.S. retains the unilateral right to attack whenever it wants.
That's a functional demolition of the rule of law on the world stage. But this rejection of international constraints, it goes beyond just military action to human rights conventions too, right?
It does, which really reinforces that literal rogue state label. The source notes the U.S. approach to human rights conventions is really instructive. When the U.S. finally signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, which guarantees basic liberties, it basically eviscerated the treaty with a ton of reservations.
And what did those reservations actually do?
They declared all the key operative articles, 1 through 27, to be not self-executing. Legally, that means the rights guaranteed by the treaty can't be used by a U.S. citizen in a U.S. court to challenge government action.
So they're inapplicable domestically.
They are rendered effectively inapplicable to the U.S. And on top of that, the U.S. rejects the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights with open disdain. These actions just confirm the doctrine. Law is secondary to power, especially if that law might constrain the economic or social policies that the elite favor.
Okay, Let's pivot now to the justifications for using force and coercion. If the Soviet threat was just a cover, what was the consistent, real enemy during the Cold War?
The real concern, which is repeatedly articulated in these closely guarded internal planning documents, was radical nationalism.
Which Chomsky defines as what?
Simply meaning intolerable independence. It refers to countries trying to pursue policies that put their own people's interests and a broader distribution of wealth first, instead of prioritizing the interests of foreign investors.
So it wasn't about tanks and missiles. It was about the spread of a dangerous idea.
Exactly. The idea that citizens could govern themselves outside the American sphere of influence, the threat was identified as the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands. Planners were terrified this example might inspire the poor and underprivileged in other countries who are now demanding opportunities for a decent living.
The virus effect.
The virus, or the rotten apple effect. A successful independent nation sets an intolerable example that has to be crushed or subverted before it can spread.
And once the Vietnam War made that old anti-communist narrative much harder to sell politically, we saw the rise of liberal internationalism as a new justification.
Yeah, the historian Samuel Moyn noted this shift, especially after the Cold War. The U.S. started championing human rights and democracy promotion as its new geopolitical role. Liberal internationalism surged, stressing rules and rights.
But Moyn saw a problem with that.
He astutely recognized that this could serve as a potential high-minded excuse for violent rulership. It perfectly paralleled Britain's earlier imperial civilizing missions. The language changed, but the interventionist impulse was exactly the same.
And the test for this moral language is whether it actually matches the reality of the intervention. The 1999 Kosovo bombing is a stark example of the timeline being inverted to fit the noble story.
It is. The common justification for the NATO bombing was that it was necessary to stop the killings and atrocities by Serbian forces. But Chomsky points out that the chronology was inverted.
How so?
The NATO commander, General Wesley Clark, actually warned the Clinton administration that the bombing would lead to an immediate, massive escalation of violence against civilians on the ground. And that's exactly what happened.
So the intervention itself caused the escalation of the very atrocities it was supposedly meant to prevent.
Precisely. The killings and expulsions escalated dramatically as a consequence of the bombing, not as the primary cause that triggered it. This is why NATO's own later indictment of Slobodan Milosevic mostly stuck to crimes committed after the NATO attack began. It's a tacit admission of that chronological inversion.
So the predictable outcome becomes the retrospective justification for the action.
It's incredibly effective narrative control.
Beyond military force, the book details the use of economic warfare as a coercive tool, often with even more devastating humanitarian consequences. The multi-decade U.S. embargo on Cuba is a primary example.
The Cuban embargo is so instructive because it became far harsher after the Soviet Union dissolved. This shows it was never really about Cold War security. It violates international humanitarian law by banning the export of food and medicine, which has demonstrably caused serious nutritional deficits and disease outbreaks.
The goal is just to cause pain.
To maximize pain, to incite domestic dissent and regime change. It's a strategy that gets called state terror when anyone else does it.
But the truly genocidal scale of economic warfare in this period was seen with the sanctions on Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War.
The sanctions system there involved the systematic destruction of Iraq's vital infrastructure, and then the intentional blocking of any repair aid and basic humanitarian supplies. We're talking ambulances, spare parts for sanitation systems, even insecticides needed to control disease. The goal is to dismantle the country's ability to function.
And the human cost of those sanctions, especially for the most vulnerable, it was staggering.
It was horrific. The source cites UNICEF estimates that the sanctions caused the deaths of over 500,000 children in just 5 years, from 91 to 96.
500,000 children.
And when Madeleine Albright, who was the UN ambassador at the time, was asked about this on national television, asked about the deaths of 500,000 children, her notorious response was, "It is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it."
The price is worth it.
Chomsky uses that quote to illustrate the ultimate, calculated ruthlessness of the systemic policy goals. The lives of 500,000 children were deemed acceptable collateral damage for a political objective.
To accept 500,000 avoidable deaths as worth it, Just shows the depth of that exemption principle.
Yeah.
And then there was the case of the U.S. refusing to even allow an investigation into the bombing of Sudan's main pharmaceutical supply.
In 1998, the U.S. bombed the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, claiming it was tied to terrorism, a claim that was widely disputed later. That one plant provided half of Sudan's essential medicines, including antibiotics and malaria treatments.
So it was a humanitarian disaster.
A major one. And the U.S. government not only refused to pay compensation, but it actively blocked a UN inquiry into the bombing's destructive impact. Again, a perfect illustration of the exemption principle in action. Accountability only applies to the designated enemy.
This relentless pursuit of coercion brings us to the ultimate engine driving so much of this policy, the corporate engine of foreign policy.
Right, and this economic imperialism is deeply rooted. It goes back to foundational planning documents like the 1945 Economic Charter for the Americas. This charter explicitly aimed to crush economic nationalism and what they called the philosophy of the new nationalism.
Which was just what nations wanting to help their own people.
It was simply the desire of nations to pursue policies aimed at a broader distribution of wealth for their own citizens.
So the plan was never for Latin American nations to develop their own independent economies.
Absolutely not. The ultimate goal was to ensure U.S. investors were the first beneficiaries of any development. The charter demanded that client states refrain from excessive industrial development that might compete with U.S. interests or, raise wages too high. It was designed to entrench a structural dependency.
And this structural power shows up today through what Chomsky calls corporatization and power.
You have these private power centers, collectivist legal entities, what we call megacorporations, that wield immense influence. They functionally dictate what the national interest even means, and they operate on a model Chomsky calls socialism for the rich.
Socialism for the rich.
They socialize risk and cost through public subsidies, military protection, bailouts, while ruthlessly privatizing all the power and profit. The political system is there to absorb the losses and protect the gains.
And this corporate power structurally undermines national sovereignty, right? It ensures that elected governments can't actually interfere with those profits.
That is the crucial point. Treaties like NAFTA and mechanisms through the World Trade Organization, the WTO, they grant these corporations extraordinary rights, like national treatment, which means foreign investors have to be treated identically to domestic ones. These rights are superior to the rights of actual people or national regulatory bodies. It's a complete subordination of popular sovereignty to investor rights.
There's a fascinating, almost bizarre case study of this. The Gerber Corporation successfully threatening Guatemala.
It's highly illustrative. Guatemala, trying to protect infant health, attempted to regulate infant formula marketing based on widely accepted World Health Organization guidelines.
Okay, sounds reasonable.
But the Gerber Corporation threatened WTO action against Guatemala, claiming this basic public health regulation violated its trade rights, and the outcome confirms the whole system's priority. Corporate trade rights consistently win out over public health, national regulation, and even basic humanitarian guidelines.
That gives us a really comprehensive look at the doctrine, the dual standards, the economic drivers. So now let's shift to systems mapping, to explicitly analyze how these pieces operate structurally to maintain this global power dynamic.
Oh, what?
Who are the key actors in these systems?
Well, the structure is clearly hierarchical. At the top, you have the global hegemon, which is primarily the U.S., often backed by the G7 industrialized nations or regional military groups like NATO, which basically functions as the enforcement arm. They set the rules, or, the lack of rules.
Then you have the direct projection of power, the military and security apparatus, which handles the violent enforcement.
Right. This includes Stratcom, the CIA, and various military planners. And their history is filled with what the source describes as state terror, all designed to stop that virus of independence from spreading.
What are some examples of that?
The book cites the CIA's role in the 1954 overthrow of the democratic government in Guatemala, which led to decades of horrific violence. It also includes direct military support for Salvadoran elite battalions known for mass murder, and even a CIA-initiated car bombing in Lebanon in 1985 that killed 80 people.
Which is deeply ironic, given that this happened at the height of the supposed U.S. fury over international terrorism.
Exactly. And as we discussed, these actions are often dictated by the needs of the private power, the corporate nexus.
Right. It's not just lobbying.
No, it's not just lobbying. Large businesses and corporate oligarchies are effectively dictating the national interest. We see this explicitly when Defense Secretary William Cohen states that U.S. unilateral force is committed to ensuring uninhibited access to key markets. The book points out that companies like Occidental Petroleum lobbied extensively for Plan Colombia, making sure that massive military aid served their commercial interests in politically unstable, resource-rich areas where they had huge investments.
And finally, to maintain public consent and legitimacy, you need the information and intellectual class to frame all of this correctly.
They function as agencies of propaganda. Their systemic role is to fulfill that dual task of state power: magnify the enemy's crimes while minimizing or erasing our own. This requires a high degree of what Chomsky calls intentional ignorance and selective amnesia about one's own complicity in violence. They create the rhetorical filter that distinguishes between worthy victims, those suffering under our enemies, and unworthy victims, those suffering under U.S.-backed regimes.
So if the whole system is designed to skirt international law and use force unilaterally, what are the inherent incentives driving unilateral action? Why not just stick to diplomacy?
The primary goal is absolutely about maintaining control and preventing that virus effect of radical nationalism. If one country successfully achieves intolerable independence, say by nationalizing resources or adopting social welfare programs, it sets a dangerous example for others in the target-rich environment of the global South.
So the cost of independence has to be kept catastrophically high.
Or the system breaks down. And the second major incentive, which is almost chillingly rationalized in official documents, is ensuring credibility. And credibility is defined in these brutal, almost pre-modern terms by military planners.
This is one of the most revealing parts of the book, isn't it?
It is. There's a 1995 Stratcom study called Post-Cold War Deterrence, and it's a key insight into how force is conceptualized. It explicitly advises rejecting a no-first-use policy for nuclear weapons and making the U.S.'s deterrence statement absolutely convincing to these so-called rogue states.
And according to the planners, you maintain that credibility by projecting an image of being, what, unpredictable and lawless.
Yes. The study actually says that the U.S. should make sure it may become irrational and vindictive if its interests are crossed. It says it's beneficial if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control.
The madman theory.
It's a rational, calculated policy decision to resurrect Nixon's madman theory, projecting unpredictable, overwhelming, destructive force, often with the shadow of nuclear weapons hanging over any crisis. Chomsky notes that the cold, rational logic behind this is familiar to any mafia don. You have to make it crystal clear that disrespecting our power carries severe and unpredictable penalties.
That internal analysis shows that lawlessness isn't an accident or a mistake. It's an explicit, calculated part of the core deterrence strategy. It's structural.
It's structural.
So let's look at the narratives used to legitimize force that mask this strategy from the public.
Well, you have to start with the founding rhetorical document of the Cold War, NSC 68. This report set the doctrinal standard for how the world was defined. It contrasted the ultimate evil of the monolithic Kremlin with the U.S.'s supposed utter perfection.
Utter perfection.
Claiming the U.S. was animated solely by generous and constructive impulses and the absence of covetousness in our international relations.
The hyperbole is so extreme, it's almost a parody of self-adulation.
It is. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously noted that administrations often pay themselves tributes that, in Europe, are usually left to poet laureates. And this framework of self-declared moral perfection, it persists, just in updated forms. The modern version is humanitarian intervention, or R2P, responsibility to protect.
But we need to clarify R2P. I know the UN adopted a version, but Chomsky highlights a critical difference in how it's used, right?
Absolutely. The original R2P, adopted by the UN, reaffirms the basic principles of the UN Charter. It stresses humanitarian motives, but still adheres to the constraint against unilateral force. But the operative version, the one championed by certain figures and planners, functionally authorizes regional groups, which really just means NATO to intervene by force in violation of the Charter.
It's a subtle legal shift that opens the door.
It allows the use of force while maintaining the facade of moral righteousness and adherence to a new global norm.
And sometimes the justification for lawlessness is so tortured and creative, it just defies belief.
The defense of the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama is a classic example. Ambassador Thomas Pickering claimed the invasion was legal under UN Charter Article 51, the right to self-defense.
Self-defense? How?
His argument was that the invasion was necessary to stop the Panamanian dictator, Noriega, from sending drugs into the United States. This creative interpretation of self-defense against a potential future domestic threat, not a foreign attack, was absurd. Yet, Chomsky notes educated opinion in the U.S. just nodded sagely in assent.
When the legal framework can be stretched that easily, it's not a constraint anymore.
It ceases to be one entirely.
So finally, how do these policies create self-perpetuating feedback loops that normalize lawlessness on the global stage?
Well, one of the most obvious loops is the open disdain for judicial decisions that might constrain power. The U.S. reaction to the World Court condemning its unlawful use of force against Nicaragua in 1986 is the foundational example. The court called for the U.S. to stop and pay reparations for its attacks on Nicaraguan harbors and its support for the Contra War.
And the U.S. response was?
Washington dismissed the World Court as a hostile forum, escalated the war against Nicaragua, and then vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that just called on all states, without even naming the U.S., to observe international law.
So if the most powerful nation openly rejects and punishes the international judicial system, it sends a clear message.
It confirms to everyone that power overrides law, period.
This requires rendering international institutions like the UN ineffective when they get in the way.
Precisely. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he was UN ambassador, publicly boasted of his no inconsiderable success in making sure the UN was utterly ineffective at stopping Indonesian crimes in East Timor, where a brutal US-backed occupation was happening. And the US holds the record for Security Council vetoes since the 1960s. It's a strong systemic indicator. If an international body doesn't serve U.S. policy interests, its ability to function is often intentionally curtailed or just demolished.
And the final loop is the domestic consequence of this sustained state terror, which leaves this terrifying residual effect that enforces the status quo.
Right. The successful use of state terror, especially in Central America and Guatemala, El Salvador, it leaves behind what's called a residual culture of terror in domesticating the expectations of the majority.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the population is compelled to abandon or just stop imagining alternatives that might be different from the ones favored by the powerful. It effectively enforces the idea that, Tina, there is no alternative to the prevailing socioeconomic order, and that insulates elites from democratic challenges both at home and abroad.
That comprehensive systems mapping lets us connect Chomsky's critique directly to its present-day implications, looking at how these structural patterns are still manifesting long after the book was written.
And the core patterns remain remarkably consistent. The post-Cold War shift just confirmed that intervention forces were still aimed at places like the Middle East, not because of the Kremlin, but because the threat had always been radical nationalism. The goals of maintaining control over energy supplies and strategic resources, as stated in the Clinton-Albright Doctrine, are still the primary drivers of policy today.
A crucial and often misunderstood example of maintaining control through forced economic policy is the case study of Haiti after the 1994 intervention.
Right. That intervention is often praised for restoring the elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, after a military coup. But it wasn't altruistic. Aristide's return was strictly conditional.
He had to accept an economic program.
He had to accept an economic program written by the U.S.-backed candidate whom he had defeated in the election. It was a structural reform program designed to achieve very specific economic outcomes.
And those outcomes were devastating for Haiti's people, but very beneficial to U.S. interests.
Exactly. The mandated program ensured the collapse of Haiti's already weak domestic economy. It forced Haiti to drastically cut tariffs and accept subsidized U.S. exports without any restrictions. And this had the predictable effect of wiping out local Haitian rice production.
Which was a huge benefit to whom?
To agribusiness in the United States, particularly in Clinton's home state of Arkansas. Clinton later apologized for the effects, claiming he couldn't have foreseen what, ironically, U.S. government agencies and economists had already predicted would happen.
And the cover-up of U.S. complicity in the atrocities that happened before the intervention just confirms that the primary goal was power, not democracy.
Yes. Clinton refused to extradite the leader of the murderous junta militias who oversaw the violence. And more importantly, he refused to return 160,000 pages of stolen documents that were feared to implicate U.S. participation in, or at least knowledge of, the junta's crimes. The systemic priority was protecting U.S. policy interests and covering up past complicity, not genuine democratic restoration.
This pattern also extends to long-term military planning through the preemptive doctrine, which enshrines the right to act first without provocation.
The Stratcom study we talked about confirms this explicit move toward preemptive action and an open rejection of the Non-Proliferation Treaty goal to ban the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. The U.S. military doctrine itself enshrines the principle of unilateral, preemptive force and the rejection of negative security assurances.
Which basically locks the nuclear shadow into every future crisis.
It does.
Let's discuss the stark implications for global inequality and instability, particularly the economic structure of control.
Chomsky describes foreign debt as a tombstone for Latin American nations, a powerful weapon of control. When nations are perpetually in debt, their economic policies dictated to them. The policies demanded by international financial institutions mean that national economic decisions in huge parts of the world are effectively run by bureaucrats in Washington, not by the elected governments of those nations.
And this debt structure is enforced by IMF and World Bank programs that actively undermine local production, creating this vicious cycle of instability.
These structural adjustment programs demand that developing countries open their borders to heavily subsidized agricultural products from rich countries. This flood of cheap imports predictably displaces local farmers, and they're left with two terrible options. Move to urban slums, which lowers wage rates for foreign investors, or get forced to grow high-value export crops to survive. Often illegal ones like coca, cannabis, and opium.
And the cruel irony, as we noted, is that the system creates the conditions for illegal crop growth destitution, no viable alternatives, and then it justifies its own violent intervention to address the consequences.
Exactly. They are attacked by military gunships, their fields destroyed by chemical and biological warfare, often through U.S.-funded programs like Plan Colombia. The system produces the crime and then justifies using military force and state terror to solve the manufactured problem. It just cements the cycle of dependency and military intervention.
And finally, we see the ongoing erosion of international norms, which the U.S. consistently demonstrates by its own isolation on key issues.
The isolation of the U.S. government on the Cuba embargo is profound. It's isolated from its own population, where polls consistently show two-thirds opposition. It's isolated from major business sectors that want to engage with Cuba, and most importantly, it's isolated from the international community.
The UN votes on this every year, right?
Every year, the UN General Assembly votes, almost unanimously, to condemn the U.S. unilateral sanctions. But the sanctions remain because the U.S. considers them a matter of domestic law that it will enforce regardless of global legal or political opinion.
This prioritization of domestic will over international consensus is a constant theme. It also shows up in the U.S. rejection of the precautionary principle.
This is a critical point about global governance.
Yeah.
At international conferences, like the one on the biosafety protocol, the U.S. insisted on using WTO trade rules. These rules demand that an import can only be banned if there's robust scientific evidence of harm.
Which overrides what?
It overrides the precautionary principle, the sovereign right of a nation to take preventative measures against potentially harmful products, like genetically altered crops, even without definitive proof of long-term harm. This again shows the structural prioritization of trade rights, which are really investor rights over national sovereignty, public health, and human welfare.
This incredibly detailed analysis really helps us connect rogue states to our broader themes here on crisis and perception, especially how power shapes perception and reality.
The foundational theme is the systematic reality of power overriding law. Dean Acheson's cynical observation that law is just useful to gild our positions with an ethos perfectly illustrates the instrumental function of lawlessness by the powerful. When global power is so overwhelmingly concentrated in a G1 situation, the rule shifts rapidly to force, and the traditional framework of world order largely ceases to exist, even in rhetoric.
It's the constant adaptation of the justification that requires such close examination. The shift from the Soviet threat to human rights and liberal internationalism is a crucial example of moral language masking coercion. The system is always looking for a high-minded excuse.
And the language is meticulously designed to ensure that the U.S. remains institutionally defined by its noble ideals and its commitment to humanity's highest values, even while official policy is actively engaged in supporting atrocities like with Turkey, Colombia, and the genocidal economic sanctions on Iraq. The source highlights that the Clinton presidency's famous noble phase language often directly correlated with mounting atrocities being actively ignored or supported by U.S. arms and aid.
And this all ties into the concept of structural inequality in global governance. This massive concentration of power doesn't just include who gets bombed, but also who gets impoverished and how the entire global economy is run.
Right. The post-war economic order, the Bretton Woods system of regulated exchange rates and capital controls, was intentionally dismantled by the US and UK in the 1970s. They replaced it with free capital flow. And this created what's often called a virtual parliament of global capital.
A virtual parliament.
This capital exercises a constant, unelected veto power over government policies aimed at social welfare, anything that might help people and not profits. And that structurally insulates powerful economic actors from democratic pressure all over the world.
So the policies of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank aren't just flawed, they are structurally designed to be human rights averse.
They are. They contribute directly and systematically to poverty and inequality while catering to the interests of their designers. The goal is to enforce the neoliberal doctrine globally. Radical market discipline for the defenseless nations, while at the same time ensuring the socialization of risk for the rich and powerful corporations. This is the operational definition of the rule of force in world affairs.
This deep dive into Noam Chomsky's rogue states helps us see the systematic behavior of states that define themselves as enlightened and entitled to violence. By meticulously comparing doctrine to actual practice, the book exposes the profound double standard inherent to the term rogue state, revealing that the most powerful, and therefore arguably the most dangerous rogue state, is often the one claiming the title of global enforcer.
It forces us to look beyond the rhetorical flourishes of political leaders and examine the actual practice of foreign policy, to focus instead on the historical and documentary record, like those Stratcom planning documents or the cynical gutting of international human rights treaties. This perspective matters critically now because, as the source concludes, the institutional factors and the economic incentives that underpin this policy of lawlessness remain fundamentally intact and unchanged.
And that leads to the crucial, unresolved question that this deep dive raises for all of us. Can the democratic institutions within the most powerful states, which are, theoretically freer than most, can they produce sufficient internal constraint to limit this unilateral violence and economic coercion? Or will the general tacit agreement among elites continue to allow the concentration of power to systematically demolish international norms and the rule of law?
That really is the crisis in perception this analysis lays bare.
This deep dive was based on the book Rogue States: The Rule of Force in World Affairs by Noam Chomsky.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.